Start trading today at pucatrade.com.
Wow.
Speak, Luis. You're on the left.
Fair enough. I guess I'm hosting the match tonight. Welcome back to the Vintage Super League. We've got Eric Froelich and myself, Luis Scott Vargas. We just saw, well, we saw some kind of match is what we saw. We saw Dredge, piloted by Randy, defeat Mentor, I guess piloted by Tom Martell, when Rest in Peace did not come into play on turn 2.
Yeah, in hindsight, I think the Rest in Peace would have been better because he would have won the game easily as opposed to losing, but I don't know. It felt like trying to get a little bit fancy and didn't really work out. Like next turn you could play Rest in Peace, Gush, and leave up Spell Pierce and Force of Will. Of course, Force of Will alone is probably going to do it, so the Rust and Pepperonis would have been pretty nice.
Yeah, it's a thing that some people are mentioning in the chat. Like, we're playing online. There are some misclicks. This is not live Magic. But in live Magic, misclicks happen too. I've seen people point removal spells at the wrong creature or tap the wrong land. So it is not unique to online play. It maybe wouldn't look exactly the same, but that's the way the cookie crumbles, I suppose.
Yeah, sometimes people say go before playing their second land or their Rest in Peace. It happens.
Yeah, and as it turns out, we probably would have gone to game 3, I think, is the conclusion we can draw there. But even in game 3, Tom has 5 Dredge Hate. It's not like he's a huge favorite or anything.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Containment Priest and Rest in Peace come down on turn 2 and we saw Randy win on turn 2 multiple times is, probably means that Randy on the play is not looking too bad. That being said, he also got to keep 7-card hands with Bazaar. So
yeah,
it's a pretty nice situation too. Of course, a turn 2 Rest in Peace in game 1, not that it's in his deck, would have been pretty good. Randy struggled to find anything that actually had the word Dredge on it. So just finding Bazaar is not necessarily enough to get the job done. But
I also think Randy's percentage of keeping 7 cards hands goes up when he uses Serum Powder, which is what he did in game 2 there to find his very good hand.
The math does not agree with you, but there's some chance. I mean, you are kind of the king of luck, so I will assume that you have done the odds, and yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see a little later whether that's true or not. But for now, speaking of lucky people, we've got David Ochoa, who misclicked on his deck list in the last chance qualifier. But he's playing Workshops against Steven Menendian playing Doomsday. If we can take a look at David Ochoa's deck list here. And here you see the full 7 spheres plus the Trinisphere. So 4 Thorn of Amethyst, 3 Sphere of Resistance, 1 Trinisphere. And, of course, the now 1 Chalice of the Void, plus the 4 Lodestone Golem. These are the cards he's going to use to try to stop Steve from going off. And then Swords, Hangerbacks, and Arcbound Ravagers are kind of what he uses to finish the game before Steve draws out of it.
Yeah, the full 7 spheres has been called.
Yeah.
Full 7.
Well, better than the 4 he had last week. Or 2
yeah,
weeks ago,
I mean,
rather.
sometimes you just forget to put cards in your deck. Sometimes you click go. It's just, these things happen. It's Magic.
They do. And he's also got 4 Leyline of Sanctity, which I hear is the nuts against Storm or Storm-based decks. So I assume he
broke it.
And if we would take a look at what Steven Menendian's playing, his deck list here, he's running Doomsday, which is one of his pet decks, I would say. Steve is a Gush fanatic. He literally wrote the book on Gush. Though, as I'm sure you saw when you watched the replay or heard about, he brainstormed into 3 Gushes last week against you, which was not exactly what he was looking for, given he had no lands in play.
Yeah, his opening hand was definitely on the sketchier side of things, and it did not get any better as time went on. Imperial Seal for Black Lotus, but Brainstorm into 3 Gushes, Yawgmoth's Will, and I think it was like a Flusterstorm or just a 5th Gush, I don't even know. Just a whole bunch of cards that could never be cast. And I had to wait a turn to see, to hope that he doesn't have a discard spell. Playing my Necropotence when I have Tendrils in hand is pretty risky against a deck that is running cards that I assumed he had cards like Thoughtseize and Duress, although I'm looking at the list now and it looks like there's just 1 Thoughtseize, no Duress between main and board. So maybe didn't have as much to fear there. Having the deck list might have meant that I would have slammed the Necro on turn 1 last week, but I didn't have access to that information, so ended up waiting a turn, and he conceded anyway on turn 2. Locked under his own Brainstorm without being able to cast a single spell while I got to draw up to 20 cards. So pretty good news for me. Yeah, Doomsday is a good deck. I mean, you've played Doomsday, I've played Doomsday. It's fun. You've got 3 Flusterstorms, 4 Mental Missteps main. Not exactly what you want to be seeing when your opponent's playing workshops. After sideboard, it looks like he's got the basic forest and a whole bunch of cards, but they're not necessarily the fastest. Trigon Predator really strong if it comes down, but it does cost 3 mana. Not always the easiest thing to do against workshops, although it does get under Thorn. And 3 Nature's Claim. So 8 good cards to bring in, and at least the 4 Mental Missteps, 3 Flusterstorms going out, and 1 other card, I guess, of his choice. Nothing is especially terrible, but nothing's especially good. So something like
Thoughtseiz's just pretty poor on the draw and mediocre on
Thoughtseize.
play. But one of the things that has really helped Doomsday is the restriction of Chalice of the Void, because now Nature's Claim is an actual card against Workshops decks, whereas before they'd always want to Chalice on 1 anyway, and I hated the fact that I would bring in this 1 mana card and just get locked out by a lock piece they already wanted. So now that Chalice is restricted, the plan of Nature's Claim, I think, gets a lot better. I really like where the green-based decks are, whereas before I would always splash red for Ingot Chewer because I just felt that Nature's Claim wasn't a card, and now it's definitely a card.
Yeah, that definitely is a dramatic improvement for the matchup. I still don't really love the matchup against Workshops, and I'm not sure exactly how you're positioned against Storm. My draws were good last week, and Steve's were quite poor. We didn't actually have a very close match, but definitely don't have the repetitions under my belt to say for sure how the matchup should be playing out.
Definitely, and I agree. I would rather be on the Workshop side than the Doomsday side here. Doomsday is a great deck. I love playing it, and Workshop, well, it's also a great deck. I guess we'll leave it at that. But I think that Workshop's his favorite. It has so many cards that make Doomsday's game plan really hard to enable, and its win condition is just cast its cards, whereas Doomsday has to set up a lot more complicated scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd rather be on the Workshop side, and if it turns out you'd rather be on the Storm side, that means Doomsday's not going to be the best positioned deck right now. But that being said, it is extremely powerful. You do get to play essentially a control deck that can go off with multiple different combos. You have the Fastbond Gush, Yawgmoth's Will, Tendrils, and you just have Doomsday to win the game with Logmaniac. So a lot of good things going on there, and the fact that you can load your deck up with a lot of permission means the deck will always be strong, even if it doesn't have necessarily the best matchups right now.
And it sounds like the players are ready, so let's go ahead and head on down. Alrighty, and it looks like David Ochoa won the die roll, which is a key part of the strategy. Both players, I think, are going to keep their opening hands. David, because he's got turn 1 Thorn of Amethyst, which you pretty much can't mulligan a hand that does that. And Steve, because he's got a whole grip of Force of Wills.
Yeah, Steve has the permission he needs, but he's going to be down a lot of cards. I mean, turn 1 Thorn, turn 2 Lodestone Golem is a fantastic start. Steve's got the answers to both of them, but it's going to leave him basically out of gas. That being said, he does have Mystical Tutor, which can go get Ancestral Recall that he knows his shop's opponent can't interact with. So he's going to get to refill. Things look pretty good for both our players, so we should have a good game.
Yeah, what I think is going to happen here is David's going to lead on Ancient Tomb, Thorn of Amethyst. Steve is going to force pitching another Force of Will, and because it's unlikely that he needs all 3, and then he gets to draw and just play a land and pass and gets to see what he wants to pitch turn 2, because with Mystical Tutor and Dark Ritual, he could also potentially set up a Doomsday. He's a couple cards short of that, but if he draws like a Gush or something along those lines, I guess he still really doesn't have the second land. So yeah, the most likely scenario by far is Steve pitching Force of Will, then Time Walk to his first 2 Force of Wills, and then
I would support Force of Will pitching Time Walk here, actually, just because if you do draw something like Ancestral Recall, you're going to really want those extra forces. They're so good in the matchup. And Time Walk is like, I mean, it's fine. Like, it's a good card. I mean, one of the best cards ever printed, but it doesn't do as much in the matchup as potentially another Force of Will would do. So that would be my line there.
So now Steve drew a Preordain. It's not clear that he wants to cast it though. He can play the Misty Rainforest and just pass, potentially setting up Mystical for Ancestral. He does have 1 basic island in his deck, so if he wants, he can get that and cast turn 1 Preordain. But I kind of like just having extra blue cards in my hand, though. Like you said, if you had 2 forces here, you would be looking better. I agree with that. You can pitch Preordain to Force, and your hand is Mystical Tutor, Force, Dark Ritual, because Time Walk is unlikely to do a whole lot.
Yeah, if your opponent does nothing this turn, you actually get to sack Misty Rainforest, get Underground Sea, Mystical Tutor, get Doomsday, Dark Ritual, Doomsday with Forcible backup, and win the game next turn. That's not going to happen. Dave's going to cast a Lodestone Golem, but let's say his turn was just like,
Two
Mishra's
Ravagers or
Workshop,
something.
Hangerback Walker. Then Steve actually gets to set up to win in 2 turns. So
Steve
that's another big benefit, I believe, of just saying go.
Steve could also preordain and try to find a second land, as people in the chat are pointing out, which is fine, but the problem is if you miss on that second land, then your Mystical Ancestral plan is really bad. Whereas right now, your Mystical Ancestral plan, you know it's going to work out.
Yeah, I mean, looking at this hand right now, the fact that he drew a blue card especially is part of the reason why I actually really like pitching Time Walk instead of Force of Will, just because if you do Mystical for Ancestral, let's say you have to cast a Force of Will this turn, which you will, you have Force of Will available in all likelihood next turn as well, so I think that does a lot of good things. That being said, Time Walk could potentially be a card, although you're planning on tapping your mana on your turn to actually cast the Ancestral, so it's
I wouldn't
unlikely
be
for Time Walk to
surprised if
be on,
Steve
and you
pitched
probably
Time
can
Walk
pitch it
here.
now.
Yeah.
Exactly, which is part of the reason why I would want to have kept that card.
So Steve has survived the first barrage of threats. David's hand is not particularly disruptive. It's a reasonable clock, but doesn't have any disruption. So if Steve's Ancestral works out here, then Steve could be in really good shape.
Yeah, that's for sure true. And plus, Dave's lands are both Ancient Tombs, and
Oh,
so
Steve just got
wow,
Doomsday. He's just
I
going for it.
really dislike this.
This loses
You
to
have to have,
Wasteland or a Sphere.
yeah,
So
it's not great. Like if your opponent just plays like a Tango Wire, it's going to be close. Like they have so many turns to find any of those cards you just named to beat you. Um, yeah,
well,
I don't.
David he is putting David on the spot. David has 4 cards left in his hand. They have to be one of Wasteland or one of the Spheres, and Tango Wire does get you a number of draw steps here.
Yeah. Does Wasteland actually do it? Like, can't you just make Black Lotus the first card when you have preordain and go from
Yeah,
there?
that's true.
If Wasteland did it, this line is horrific because Webb didn't actually have a chance to play Wasteland. Your opponent led on Misty Rainforest, and you had a great 2-drop and a great 4-drop. So if he had a Wasteland, it wouldn't have been played. So if your line's going to lose to Wasteland, you definitely can't do it. That being said, I believe that you should be able to get a pile, although can you actually win this turn? If you get Black Lotus, you cast your
Next turn
preordain,
you
you
Lotus
get
preordain into
Ancestral.
Ancestral.
Right, but that's not
Yeah.
enough cards. If you were going to get Mox, Gataxian Pro, Glad Maniac, you would need 4.
So if you get Lotus Ancestral, and you'll have 1 mana floating, assuming you get wasted, and then your last 3 cards can be Lotus Petal, Dark Ritual, Yawgmoth's Will, but then you need a win condition, so you're probably not going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely ways to win in 2 turns, but then you're giving your opponent more opportunity again to actually do something. It's possible they can kill you with damage in 2 turns. If Steve actually sets up a hand that wins not next turn, it's possible that Webb will just win the game with Ravagers because Steve's life's going to be down to 8.
Though Steve, when he has Underground Sea in play, I feel like, which he's most likely going to, unless Webb draws one of his 5 Wasteland or Strip Mines, then it's likely that he can set up a pile that will kill next turn without.
Right. I guess I was factoring in assuming you got Wastelanded. Otherwise, he has the extra mana, so he can just go get Black Lotus, cast Preordain off his land, cast Ancestral Recall to have 1 card left in his library, 2 mana floating, Mox, Lab Maniac, and Pro.
Look, I saw Lotus Petal and Yawgmoth's Will highlighted, so it looks like that Steve went for a game plan involving those. All right, this is up to David. He's got 1 draw step, and he's got a lot of cards in his deck that are impactful here. Many of which win in the game, some of which just buy him time. Tango Wire might be enough to win the game with an Arcbound Ravager. You just go Tango Wire, Ravager, go.
Well, Webb is now, I believe, looking at Menendian's
Yeah.
exile pile so that he knows exactly what he's up against.
If I were Webb, I would draw for my turn first. It becomes relevant if you draw like a Chalice of the Void or something along those lines.
He drew a Sphere.
Sphere of Resistance is apparently a crowd favorite.
Honey, I'm going to need you to be quiet now.
Which also represents the fact that Steve is a huge underdog here.
Shh.
Webb was a small dog before drawing his card, and now Steve's a huge dog after Webb drew.
Yeah, interesting line to go for Doomsday. I mean, you have literally nothing suggesting that Webb wouldn't have more lock pieces. I mean, he played one on turn 1 and 2. He still has 4 cards, drawing up to 5. Now, Webb's job here, I can't imagine that he's not playing Sphere, and so he's just figuring out exactly which 5 cards there are. But I don't think that... Maybe there's outs. Like, he's going to have enough mana that he can cast a Lab Maniac. If Webb can't kill him in a few turns, that will just do it. But, like, he can cast Black Lotus.
Webb is just doing his due diligence here. I think Webb's turn is going to be Arcbound Ravager, Mishra's Factory, Sphere of Resistance. He could play Sphere first, I guess. It doesn't really matter too much, but...
yeah, he doesn't have any other option this turn. Unless he's figured... No, that doesn't even make sense. If you figure that Steve can't... What were you saying?
Rich just said, Webb, don't F6. which is good advice.
Yeah. That has happened a lot of times in this league. That has happened a lot of times over the course of the few seasons in this league, but luckily it has not happened to Webb yet, or Steve, or Rich, or you, or me, or Bob, or Kai, or Randy.
Chris is actually pointing out that Sword of Fire and Ice plus Sphere might be better than Ravager because you have Mishra's Factory, and next turn you can attack for 6, which is potential. Does Ravager have a way to kill you next turn? Not quite, right? You could, because even if you sack the Sphere, no, you're like a couple points short here. So David just deciding which one is better. I mean, he does have options here. He might as well take his time.
All we have is time.
As the hourglass of our lives runs downwards, but
the key right now is make sure that your mouse is over that sphere and not over OK. Twice.
That does help.
You'd have to click through it twice, yeah. Unless he also has beginning of combat somehow marked, in which case he would accidentally have to click OK 3 times.
So David springs into action here. He's dropping Sphere, which means that he's going to play
about Webb springing into anything.
Yes.
Post haste.
So Steve set it up so he drew Ancestral first, so he wouldn't actually have beaten a Wasteland given that information. Maybe he would have, like maybe a couple turns later he does, but...
Right. I mean, there has to be artifact mana in there. You saw Lotus Petal, which means there's Black Lotus.
Correct.
How is Yawgmoth's Will? Is Yawgmoth's Will good? I guess it's fine. Same as anything else.
So David
Ancestral,
also...
Lotus, Petal, Yawgmoth's Will, Preordain, Lab Maniac. No, you don't even have enough mana to do that, do you?
I think David also wants to make sure that he doesn't die to like Lotus Tendrils or something like that. Not that Steve's like all that close to that happening. I guess pay 1 for Lotus, sack Lotus, play Dark Ritual, and you're 1 short of Tendrilsing still. But at this point, that ship has sailed. Webb is going to die to Tendrils.
Yeah, also I'm sure Webb can look at the exile pile and see the Tendrils is there. And the fact that Webb was at like 12 life or 14 life when this started. I think he was at 14. Yeah, Webb should know the exact 5 cards. He has the deck list and he has access to the exiled zone, so he knows it's Ancestral, and I'm guessing Lab Maniac, Black Lotus, Lotus Petal, Yawgmoth's Will. If we saw Lotus Petal, Yawgmoth's Will, those are not the cards that I think I would have gotten, but I believe those are the cards that have been retrieved.
I don't know if Webb's the kind of player who would really look at the deck list to figure out exactly what Steve has in his hand.
No, he is not known for being meticulous or his fine butcher skills, craftsmanship, making sure that there isn't a drop of sauce or food left on his plate.
Steve can Ancestral here and
die.
Yeah.
Basically. All right, so
well, turns out Webb put up some resistance.
I wonder how this game ends up playing out. This is the thing with Vintage Super League. I always am so curious. How does the game play out if they took this line? Like,
there's always lots of different lines. So, I do think that Leyline of Sanctity is intended for combo. I don't know if Webb's going to side it in. The problem is Steve isn't playing Hercule's Recall, and he isn't playing Tendrils as his main win condition. So the leyline gets a lot less attractive. I guess Webb's slamming them anyway. No, he's just moving them around. But
Webb is playing with his sideboard food.
Steve instantly
I
puts
guess
in
he has nothing.
Trigons.
I mean, Sword of Fire and Ice is pretty bad.
Well, if your opponent's on Trigon, it might not be the worst. You play Lodestone, they play Trigon, you're like, sword hit you for 9, then they have to kill the sword, they can't kill the Lodestone. That's not the end of the world. Also, Diaphan, who I've played numerous times in Vintage before, pointed out in the chat much earlier that Triskelion makes Trigon a lot worse. The Trigon plan is much, much worse if your opponent's loaded up on Triskelions.
Yeah, I mean, he's got cards like Dismember as well. I still don't really like the sword plan. I mean, if you're able to have Lodestone and sword, like the odds of them even getting to the mana to cast Trigon is rough. I mean, just getting around that Lodestone alone, let alone anything else. I mean, you're playing a deck with 4 Wastelands, Strip Mine, 7 Spheres, etc. So it's not an easy sell for me on the sword. So I do think it's a little bit slow, and I definitely respect the decision to board it out if that's the way he goes. But I haven't played very much against Trigon to know for sure.
And it looks like Webb did, in fact, not take out the swords, and he put in Worm Coils, because those are resistant to Trigon, and Dismember, because Dismember is actually a good way to catch a Predator. You see if taps out for it, you just kill it with Dismember.
Yeah, Trigon Predator is a real predator. Let's see these hands.
David's hand is great here. It's basically got a mix of everything you want. You would trade one of your Ravager or Revoker for another Sphere, but otherwise it's great.
Yeah. Steve's hand, we're going to need him to pop out his graveyard so we can see the last card, but it looks like it's pretty bad. It's a Mox Jet, which is actually pretty good.
That's what makes this hand great, because Steve can now go turn 1 Demonic Tutor with Force of Will backup, setting up turn 2 Doomsday or turn 2 Trigon Predator.
Yeah. Of course, Steve is going to go for Doomsday because he can. We've already learned that.
I've had the pleasure of doing commentary on Steve's first 2 matches this season, and Steve has made the most aggressive play every single turn of every single game. He has gone for the throat. I mean, that is his game plan. Actually, Steve.
So is he going to do it now? Is he going to go get Lotus and Doomsday right now?
Actually, I think he is. I think he's going to DT. You'd want to get Island here. DT Island, DT Lotus, Doomsday. I mean, why not?
Well, why not? Is that he can't actually cast the Gush in his hand.
Well, he can
Force of Will. Yeah, no, it's very reasonable.
I think he's going to.
You're right.
So David's going to have some options, because David has 2 relevant plays on turn 1. He has Revoker for Mox Jet, or Black Lotus is probably the more likely. So if you're David, what do you lead with? Because you got to expect a Force of Will here. You're going to go. I could definitely see Mishra's Workshop play Revoker, or Mishra's Workshop play Thorn. Both, I think, end the game against most piles. And I actually think that Revoker... No, it's probably Thorn is the most dangerous one. They're both very good, though.
Yeah, I would think that Thorn is the better card of the 2, but
yeah,
but I might just be wrong. That's just my initial thinking. I'd have to actually think about it. The thing is, you'll know, again, because you'll know exactly the 5 cards.
Exactly.
Probably. I mean, we've sideboarded this time, but it should be pretty obvious. And from there, you just figure out what his game plan is going to be. Like, can he beat Revoker on Lotus? And if he can't, then you've got Revoker on Lotus. Like, he's going to be able to figure out the hand. Like, he's going to know that there's a Trigon Predator. I guess you don't know whether there's a Gush in the deck or in his hand kind of thing, because you can assume he has a land. There's going to be a Gush missing from one of these piles. You can assume that one of the cards is Trigon. You're going to know Force of Will's gone. So you know exactly what you're up against, and you just go from there.
Well, the other thing to note is that Webb can guarantee resolve a Revoker. He can't guarantee resolve Thorn.
Well,
he can,
to be fair, Steve is still in the tank. He has not decided to get Lotus. And this is... Demonic Tutor has been on the stack for, I think, over a minute. So I
true. He might not
actually other game plans.
He might not actually Doomsday turn 1. I like Steve's spot as in Doomsday. We're talking about him being aggressive, but I like him being aggressive here. You've got a basic land, so you're immune to Wasteland, and you have Force of Will. The Shops deck has to draw exactly Mana Crypt or Black Lotus to have 2 relevant plays turn 1, unless they draw Workshop, Mox, Double Sphere if you force the first Sphere. But
well, considering Revoker's a relevant card here, it's a little bit more likely. But yeah, I guess, it does require a pretty specific set.
Like, what is Steve's other option here? if he doesn't get
Good
Lotus
question.
for Doomsday. He could get Ancestral Recall, but that just seems kind of weak. Like, you can just easily lose that game.
Yeah, I mean, he could get something as simple as. Yeah, it seems so bad, actually. I was going to say you get like Tropical Island and have Trigon Gush, but he's going to have to use Force of Will, so he's not going to have both those cards anyway. I don't know.
You know, and like we were talking about before, so Steve did not go for it. He just
got
went for basic
basic.
Forest.
All
Interesting.
right, so he's looking to play the long Trigon Predator game, which I think works out much better against Webb's hand.
I don't even know if it does, though.
Well,
Webb
it works
has a
out better than the
Triskelion.
fact he just loses.
True. He does.
If he
It
did
does
it the
work
other
out
line,
better
he would
than
have lost.
losing.
Yes. So now the game is going to play out. He's a big dog.
Well,
I
this
think.
is definitely a more interesting
it's-
game. I like that this happened.
Well, the interesting thing is if Webb leads on something like, oh, I guess you can't. I was going to say if he leads on Thorn, it doesn't really impact you that much with Uni of Trigon and Basic Forest, but that being said, you can't force a will to follow up play, and so Webb would still get to resolve another card.
Definitely. You know, I like Webb. No, like what? This is why I love watching these players play. Webb. You know, he's thinking about the fact that Steve has Trigon Predator in his deck, and that's why he's going to play the Sphere of Resistance over the Thorn, or at least that if he does play it, I believe that's why he played it, and he's definitely considering the implications of which Sphere to cast. Whereas a lot of players, I think, would just play Thorn because it doesn't impact their hand as much.
Yeah, casting Sphere does mean that it turns off his ability to play Triskelion next turn if it resolves, but of course if it resolves, that turns off Steve's ability to play Trigon.
Well, what David could do is he could play Thorn, forcing Steve to force if he wants to force, and then follow it up with Sphere, so he could guaranteed resolve Sphere. Steve is, well, forced into this, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
But then David, playing around Trigon, could go workshop name Mox Jet with his Phyrexian Revoker.
Except if your opponent plays Forest Trigon Predator, you just get to play Triskelion.
Yeah, that's true too.
So either way, Webb's going to be in a great spot.
And one thing I do like about playing Revoker here is that a lot of Steve's hands will have relied on that Mox Jet. It's possible that Steve is kept a hand of, or like DT'd setting up like a Dark Ritual or a Doomsday or something along those lines, though. That's less likely than just getting a Lotus. But I mean, Steve has a Doomsday out with an island, a forest, and a tropical island. Like, he's very far away from casting that. I think David's in very good shape here.
Oh, he's definitely in great shape. I mean,
So
he can just slam Triskelion if he wants to.
Yeah. If you're David, are you just looking to slam Trike at this point?
Yeah, I think that.
Well,
I guess your opponent could have Nature's Claim.
the circumstances have changed.
Yeah, Webb's draws have been phenomenal. Every draw step's been great too.
Yeah, Webb is he is making workshops look unbeatable, is what he's doing, which I assume they are and will continue to be.
Yep, factual. As long as the luckiest people continue to play them, they will win.
So Steve can now tap out for a Ponder, but that just means that Webb's going to get an opportunity to wasteland the Tropical Island and play a Ravager, or potentially even just play Triskelion.
It doesn't matter. This game's stone over.
I agree. So had Steve gone for the turn one Doomsday, I think that Webb would have still won, because Webb would have led with like Thorn and then played a Sphere or a Revoker, and either one of them delays Steve enough so the second one comes down, which then end the game.
Yeah, Steve had a somewhat reasonable chance with the way that he played the game, and I believe that if he went turn one Doomsday, he was dead on the spot. The way this game played out, Webb's first two draws were Sphere Resistance, Lodestone Golem, which is pretty much the perfect draws. Really put Steve in a bad spot where he couldn't actually cast Trigon Predator and then got completely locked out of the game while facing a clock that's extremely fast. His out at that point was kind of Mana Crypt doing a bunch of damage and maybe Trigon coming down to sweep the leg later on. Wasn't going to work especially well because of Triskelion, but let's say Steve was able to find a card like Force of Will. Maybe. I mean, he was probably going to lose because Webb's hand was so good. Of course, Webb's first two draw steps were pretty much exactly what you'd want.
Yep.
You could get slightly better, but whatever.
Not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot.
And you know, I have to go back to that point that Triskelion makes me a lot less excited about the Trigon plan. It used to be that the Trigon plan, I think, was a pretty solid option for Doomsday. Nature's Claim got better. Trigon Predator got a lot worse. All the Doomsday decks, or all the Workshops decks, just play 3 Trikes now.
Yeah, I mean, Triskelion and Dismembers and Tangle Wire, which wasn't always a thing as well, that really makes it hard to cast 3-mana spells. It is a lot easier to cast 1-mana spells, as you noted, without, Chalice of the Void being restricted. Nature's Clean gets a lot better, but 3-mana spells got quite a bit worse, I think, the way that decks are built. Especially ones that die to Triskelion. Can also just be blocked by Hangerback tokens.
That's true.
All right, so I think I like playing Ravager Wasteland here over Triskelion. Either way, he's going to win the game next turn, and it doesn't actually matter based on Steve's hand. Just think it's slightly better play to shut him off of 1 mana. But
Wasteland just makes things a little bit safer, just so you
Yeah.
don't lose to some combination of like Nature's Claim into black. I didn't even see how that could work. There's 2 sphere effects in play.
yeah,
This is when you really appreciate the fact that David Ochoa is considering all of Steve's potential outs and deciding which line to take, even though I think that Steve could stack his deck and still couldn't win.
All right, so David Ochoa going to go to 2-0 with Shops. He's won 7 matches in a row.
Yeah.
I think he won 5 in a row after losing. He won
did.
6-1 total. I couldn't remember exactly which round he actually lost. And he's going to get the first 2 here. So a nice little run for David Ochoa.
Deciding how he wants to finish this game because he has 8 points of attackers and then play Triskelion.
Yeah, I appreciate last week that Steve just kind of scooped against me instantly when the game was over, as opposed to seeing whether I misclicked through with my. I guess I couldn't attack. I'm not playing that deck, but in this case, I don't know how many turns Webb would have to. How many times? This is an interesting question.
Yeah, how many times if Webb just was jamming F6 would it take for Steve to win? I don't know.
Just the OK button. If he was going to misclick OK enough times, where does it come where Steve becomes the favorite? I'm thinking it's in the 70 range.
It's
assuming you have to click on all the steps, like every time Steve casts a spell, and along those lines. At that point, I think Steve gets close to 50%.
Yeah. So we saw both players kind of like their dead. Like Steve's deck did what it was supposed to do post board. It had a turn 1 Force of Will into a turn 2 Trigon. It just Webb drew the Mana Crypt. Mana Crypt was really the key card there. It just let him play 2 disruptive spells on turn 1, then played another one on turn 2, then another 2 on turn 3 somehow. So it was at that point Steve got into a hole. And once you start getting behind the 8-ball against the Mishra's Workshop decks, you just almost never get out of it because they draw lock pieces faster than you draw mana sources.
Yeah, I mean he did have the opportunity to go for turn 1 Doomsday. Chose to pass that up. Again, it wouldn't have worked because Webb's hand was so good, but it is interesting considering how he's played out all the other games that he did not go for that line.
Indeed. So next up is the most exciting match of the night. I've got myself on Uba Stacks, which was described as worse than a normal Shops deck in every way except you get a cooler name, versus you playing a Dark Petition Storm deck. Luckily, I came prepared, so...
It's the mirror match.
Yep, the full-on mirror. So we're going to be back in a couple minutes with that, and until then, we've got some commercials for you.
Jerk.